Mesa Verde was recently named another international dark sky park for the exceptional quality of its star-filled nights. It's already been designated as a World Heritage Site featuring the best preserved structures of the Pueblo people.
In the winter of 1888, two ranchers searching for lost cattle rode along the rim of a canyon in southwestern Colorado and looked across the gorge into a site that would change how the world understood ancient America. Tucked into a massive sandstone alcove sat a city of stone, towers, plazas, and rooms stacked 3 and 4 stories high, untouched since its builders had walked away from it centuries before. Richard Wetherill and his brother-in-law named it Cliff Palace, and within a few years it had become the symbol of an entire civilization. Photographs of it circulated across the country. Visitors came by wagon, then by car, then by the millions, and nearly every one of them did the same thing. They looked up at the cliffs, admired the masonry, and left believing they had seen the whole story. What almost none of them realized is that the most revealing part of Mesa Verde was never in the walls they could photograph. It was beneath their boots, sealed into the ground, in rooms built for a purpose that had nothing to do with everyday shelter. Mesa Verde is not one ruin, but a landscape of them. Archaeologists have cataloged more than 4,000 sites scattered across its mesa tops and canyon walls, including several hundred cliff dwellings of varying size. The people who built all of it are known today as the ancestral Puebloans, and they were not a passing presence. They settled this high, dry tableland around the 6th century and stayed for roughly 700 years, farming corn, beans, and squash on the mesa tops, raising families, and constructing an architectural tradition that grew more sophisticated with every generation. By the time UNESCO named Mesa Verde one of the first World Heritage Sites in 1978, the cliff dwellings had already become shorthand for the entire culture. But that shorthand leaves out the part of the story that actually explains who these people were. To find the real center of ancestral Puebloan life, you have to go back before the cliffs were ever built on. The earliest homes on Mesa Verde were not perched in alcoves at all. They were pit houses, structures dug directly into the earth and roofed over with timber and packed soil, so that daily life happened partly underground from the very beginning. This wasn't an accident of convenience. Digging into the earth provided insulation against brutal winters and scorching summers. But over time, something else happened. Certain underground spaces stopped being used for ordinary living and started being reserved for something else entirely. Archaeologists refer to this transitional form as a proto-kiva, a structure caught between an ordinary home and a dedicated ceremonial chamber. Over the centuries, as pit houses evolved into surface dwellings built from stone, these proto-kivas evolved alongside them into a fully distinct architectural form. The kiva, a circular room built down into the ground, separate from where people slept and cooked, and reserved for something the community considered sacred. To understand Mesa Verde, you need to understand what a kiva actually was, because calling it a room barely captures its function. A kiva was where religious ceremonies took place. It was where community decisions were debated and made. It was where the young were taught the stories and skills that would carry the group forward. It was where ritual performances bound an entire village together through shared belief. In modern terms, imagine folding a church, a town hall, a school, and a theater into a single space, then building that space underground and treating the act of entering it as something set apart from ordinary life. People did not sleep in kivas or store their belongings there the way they did in their surface homes. The separation was deliberate. The underground was treated as a different register of existence, reserved for what the daylight world was not meant to hold. The engineering inside a well-built kiva is genuinely remarkable given the tools available 8 centuries ago. A fire pit typically sat at the center of the floor. Nearby, a narrow ventilation shaft ran down from the surface to draw fresh air into the chamber, and builders placed a single upright stone slab, called a deflector, between that shaft and the fire so that incoming air would curve around the flames instead of extinguishing them. Low benches ran along the curved walls, and stone pilasters rose from those benches to help support a heavy roof made of timber and earth. The result was a sealed chamber where a fire could burn steadily for hours without smoking out the room or gutting in a draft, allowing dozens of people to sit together through the coldest nights of the year in a controlled, deliberately atmospheric environment. Entry came only from above, through a hole cut in the roof and a wooden ladder that descended into the dark, meaning every person who entered a kiva did so by climbing down, leaving the surface world behind them step by step. The single most telling detail in any kiva, though, is easy to miss entirely. A cut into the floor, usually near the fire pit, is a small hole, often no wider than a fist. It's called sapapu, and in the living traditions of Puebloan peoples today, it represents the place of emergence, the point where the ancestors first climbed up out of the worlds below into this one. It is a symbolic doorway connecting the present community to its own origin story, built directly into the architecture of the room. No ordinary meeting hall needs a carved passage to the ancestral world. No storage room needs a symbol of emergence built into its floor. The presence of the sapapu tells us plainly that these underground chambers were never simply functional. They were where a community kept its understanding of where it came from. And that understanding survives not as archaeological speculation, but as living belief carried forward by the descendants of the people who dug these rooms in the first place. Beneath Cliff Palace itself, excavators found something that still generates debate today. 2 kivas in the complex, which contains more than 150 rooms and over 20 kivas in total, are connected not by a walkway or an open plaza, but by a narrow underground tunnel cut through rock and rubble. Why anyone would build a hidden passage linking one ceremonial chamber to another is a question without a settled answer. The most compelling theory, though unproven, is that the tunnel served a theatrical or ritual function, allowing a participant to disappear from one kiva and reappear in another during a ceremony, echoing the very idea encoded in the sapapu, emergence from below into the world of the living. It's an elegant hypothesis, and it fits the symbolic language of the culture almost too neatly, which is exactly why serious archaeologists are careful not to present it as fact. The tunnel is real and documented. Its purpose remains genuinely unresolved, and honest scholarship treats it that way rather than manufacturing certainty where none exists. What makes Mesa Verde's underground world so significant isn't a single dramatic feature like the tunnel, though. It's the sheer scale and integration of kivas into everyday life. When researchers counted rooms across the settlements, they found roughly 1 kiva for every few surface living rooms, meaning ceremonial space wasn't rare or restricted to an elite class. Nearly every cluster of households had its own small kiva, while larger communities also built what archaeologists call great kivas, sized to gather people from an entire settlement at once. The sacred and the domestic were never separated into different districts the way we tend to organize cities today, with a cathedral on a hill or a temple at the center of town. At Mesa Verde, the sacred sat directly beneath the ordinary. People ground corn, mended tools, and raised children just a few feet above rooms where that same community met to conduct its most important spiritual and political business. Belief wasn't a destination people traveled to on special occasions. It was built into the ground they walked on every day. This arrangement held for roughly 7 centuries, and then, within the span of 1 or 2 generations near the end of the 13th century, it stopped. The people of Mesa Verde left, and they left quickly. The fires in the kivas went cold, and no one returned to relight them. For a long time, this abrupt departure fed into sensational theories about a vanished civilization, but modern science, particularly the study of tree rings pioneered by astronomer Andrew Ellicott Douglas in the early 20th century, gives us a far more grounded picture. Tree ring analysis of timber from the region reveals a severe, sustained drought settling over the Southwest in the final decades of the 1200s. For a farming society entirely dependent on rainfall to grow corn on the mesa tops, that kind of prolonged drought wasn't an inconvenience. It threatened the basic foundation of survival. Adding to the picture, most of the famous cliff dwellings, including Cliff Palace itself, were built late in the occupation, largely within the final century before the region emptied out. That timing suggests something important. For most of their 700 years on Mesa Verde, these people lived primarily on the open mesa tops, And only near the very end did they retreat into defensible alcoves in the canyon walls, hauling stone and timber into tight overhangs to build their most spectacular architecture, just as conditions were deteriorating around them. People generally don't move into a cliff face for the scenery. They do it when they need protection. Drought alone likely doesn't explain the full picture, though, and careful archaeology resists reducing complex human history to a single cause. 7 centuries of continuous, dense settlement would have placed real strain on the land itself. Thinning nearby forests cut for fuel and construction, exhausting soils, and depleting game. Some sites from the final decades show signs of conflict. There may also have been social and religious strain, a sense that the old framework, centered on those underground ceremonial rooms, was no longer holding communities together the way it once had. What we can say with confidence is what didn't happen. These people were not erased and did not simply disappear. They migrated south and east toward the Rio Grande Valley and the lands of the Hopi and Zuni peoples, carrying their architectural traditions, their ceremonial practices, and their origin stories with them. The Puebloan peoples of the American Southwest today are their direct descendants, and it is through those living communities, not guesswork from broken pottery, that archaeologists understand what the Sipapu means and why the kiva mattered so much in the first place. The real mystery isn't where the people of Mesa Verde went. It's why they left so completely and so fast and never returned to live in the cities they had spent generations perfecting. Today, researchers are uncovering this history without the destructive excavation that once seemed unavoidable. LiDAR scanners fire thousands of laser pulses to build precise 3-dimensional models of structures without a single tool touching ancient stone. Drones capture angles of canyon alcoves that would be dangerous or impossible to reach on foot. Photogrammetry stitches together hundreds of overlapping photographs into detailed digital models that researchers can study indefinitely. These tools let archaeologists measure the stability of aging walls, map the relationship between ceremonial and residential spaces, and even detect faint traces of structures hidden under centuries of soil and brush across the wider landscape, all without disturbing what remains. The picture that emerges isn't of an isolated ruin, but of an interconnected world, still only partially understood. There is no lost underground city beneath Mesa Verde, no secret network of tunnels linking every canyon into a hidden metropolis. That version of the story belongs to speculation, not evidence. The real hidden world is quieter and in its own way more remarkable. A landscape of kivas and proto-kivas, of ancient pit houses and communal chambers, of one genuinely unresolved tunnel beneath Cliff Palace, and of a small sacred hole cut into stone floors that carried more meaning than any tower built above it. It is the record of a civilization that chose to place its deepest beliefs, its origin story, its sense of where it came from, beneath the surface, and built its visible architecture almost as an afterthought layered on top. That is what 2 ranchers on horseback couldn't see across a snow-filled canyon in 1888, and it's what most visitors still walk past today on their way to photograph the towers. The real Mesa Verde was never really about what was visible from across the gorge. It was about what generations of people chose to bury, protect, and return to again and again in the dark beneath their own feet.